He stayed in his room for the next 3 days to exercise, masturbate, listen to music, stone, read slim books on philosophy, and live his secret life. In Delhi's sun, the 3 days might have been terrestrial bliss, but in Madna, he enjoyed his usual tepid insanity. The lizards chasing one another around Tamsi's painting, an exhausting courtship. Then the dubious consolations of Marcus Aurelius, whose wisdom at moments he found infinitely amusing. Do unsavory armpits and bad breath make you angry? What good will it do you? Given the mouth and armpits the man has got, that condition is bound to produce those odors. Yet, who continued to fascinate him by his oscillations between disgust and a longing for the cessations of its causes? For 3 days he opened the door only for Vasant and Digambar. On 2 nights he walked along the rail tracks for miles. On the fourth afternoon he had just finished a joint when a very noisy jeep stopped outside the room. A knock on the door. A smiling stranger. Before he could say anything, Agastya said, "I am ill. I can't go anywhere." Behind the stranger stood the circus jeep. "Myself, Ado Tiwari," said the stranger. 2 months later, Agastya realized that Ado was not part of Tiwari's name, but actually ADHO, Additional District Health Officer. "Mr. Bajaj has sent me. You wanted to visit Baba Ramana's rehabilitation home?" "Certainly not." Tiwari, quite predictably, looked a little nonplussed at the vehemence of his answer. "But," he began in reply, and of course eventually Agastya lost the argument and sat in the jeep, and not totally reluctantly. For one thing, it felt nice just to sit inside such a jeep. He felt a little like Yuri Gagarin. Then he would be traveling alone because Tiwari explained, "Bajaj Saab has work and DHO Saab also, and myself also. But Bajaj Saab said you were so eager to see the home, so I have made a ring to the home and said, 'Mr. Sen, IAS is coming,' and they have said welcome." But what was nice was the completely purposeless journey to go stone to some unknown place. One more long jeep ride to meet some unknown people. Hopefully the Baba was rehabilitating nymphomaniacs or prostitutes. And acceptance was much less strenuous than refusal. Again he smiled, the softer option. On the road to Gorapak, winter wasn't far, but an afternoon in Madna was still warm and the town was asleep. Again through the east gate it was once used only by the elephants of a tribal king. The panwala in the niche of the gate was now alone with his transitor. The Hindi film song, hopelessly incongruous as usual, a full female voice inviting a billion listeners to sex and passion, followed them through the shacks which seemed to stretch to the horizon. "The night is alone, the lamps are dimmed, come closer, my love, into my arms." The jeep chugged along. It seemed incapable of speed. "I am used to driving slow, sir," confirmed the driver, a loquacious man, "so that when we pass people can read the messages written on the jeep." "Sir." Agastya nodded wisely. Yet one more encounter with new faces, he thought as he watched a tree and a cloud move past in slow motion, and eventually this one would also blur into the others. All that would remain distinct, perhaps, would be a few words that only he would deem significant, or an angle of face which in turn his mind would link with other things, some oddity of accent or some other words confusing time and place and people to look for a pattern, some essence. Almost an hour's drive, then in the last half mile the landscape changed. Smaller fields bordered by wire fence and eucalyptus, neat white huts with grey asbestos roofs. "The home, sir," said the driver. "Long red gravel drive with more trees, neem, middle-aged banyan. Long low huts, white and grey, around a central courtyard. No one in sight. Peaceful, occasional cries of birds from somewhere, the sound of a water pump. The home, whatever it is, thought Augustia, looks cleaner and prettier than any other place in the district. Looks like the model of a commune. A woman, 40ish, in a white sari came out from one of the grey huts, probably, Augustia thought, to wonder at the colors, sketches, and messages on the jeep, and then remembered, of course, they must have seen it here at least 100 times before. They walked towards her. Painted food for thought boards in English, Hindi, and regional language on the hut walls. The nearest one read, "Real leprosy is attached to an unclean mind. M.K. Gandhi." The driver smiled and said something to the woman. She looked at Augustia expressionlessly and asked him to follow her. 10 steps down the side of a hut and she stopped and with a hint of a smile pointed to a man approaching them from the fields behind the hut. Augustia stayed at the Baba Ramana Rehabilitation Home for lepers for more than 4 hours and quite enjoyed himself. The driver didn't, but he was paid either to drive or to wait, so he waited. Augustia didn't meet Baba Ramana himself, who was 77 and whom fame of a kind had made misanthropic. But he met the son, Raman Karant, the man who had approached them from the fields behind the hut. Karant was short and thin and wore extremely rough white khadi. "What do you want to see here, Mr. Sen?" Whatever you think I should see." "You are in the IAS, aren't you?" "Yes. If I may say so, you don't look it." "Yes." At which Karant gave him a look. 40 years ago, Baba Ramana, then with the less sage-like name of Shankaran Karant, had a lucrative medical practice in Bangalore. "He wasn't married then," said his son to Augustia, as he showed him the home's vegetable gardens. "That must have made it easier. His parents were at Tumkur. My grandmother's still alive, by the way. She's 96, is still at Tumkur." Karant pointed out the plots of spinach, carrot, radish, cauliflower. "Where do you get the water from for these fields?" asked Augustia. That was part of the Ramana story. In Bangalore, 40 years ago, with nationalism buzzing all around him, a bachelor doctor making lots of money had begun to worry about his future. His son told his story readily enough, and Augustia realized the rest. "Let us have tea first," said Karant. "Then I will show you around a little more." They moved towards a hut beyond the vegetables. On the door, a painted sign said, "Dining Hall," and above it, "To look down upon fellow human beings, to condemn any community or class of men, is a sign of a diseased mind, far worse than physical leprosy. Such men are real lepers of society." M.K. Gandhi. When I say he worried about his future, I mean he saw it only as a sort of predictable extension of his present. He objected, added Augustia silently, to the conventions of the cycle, the earning of money, marriage, the nurture of children. Floor and walls of packed earth and cow dung, asbestos over their heads, paintings on the walls, mats on the floor. The paintings were landscapes competent without being distracting. "These are much better landscapes than those put up in the government rest houses," said Augustia. "Yes," smiled Karant, but the artist who painted these had lost all his fingers to leprosy, a very advanced case. He painted with a few remaining toes. Beyond was the kitchen, the same packed earth and cow dung. Men and women in white khadi looked at Augustia and greeted Karant. Augustia surreptitiously eyed their fingers and toes. They picked up cups of tea and walked towards the well. "Some of the most unlikely people are rebels," said Karant, "sometimes against the unluckiest things. My father, I think, was also attracted by the fun of the terrible unorthodoxy of the act." Shankaran Karan searched for a place away from Bangalore where he would not be pestered by the petty intrusions and criticisms of acquaintances, and where he would not feel the pull of the city. His only major regret in the early years seemed to have been that he had had to leave Bangalore, for he had grown to love it. "Why did you want to visit this place?" Karen suddenly asked Agastya. "Is it because someone said it's one of the tourist spots of the district?" "Well, yes," he answered. "More or less." Karen laughed, a shrill, uninhibited sound. The tea was strong and oddly sweet. Agastya realized after a moment that it had gur instead of sugar. They strolled towards a clump of banana trees. "This is a very big compound," he said politely. It had, of course, been much smaller when Shankaran Karant first arrived there to try and cure physically and psychologically a few destitute lepers. "God knows, Madna town was far enough from Bangalore," said Karant, "and this place must have seemed beyond the ends of the earth. But land was very cheap here. Gorapak, perhaps because of the temple, had lepers to spare, and the water table in this plains area was high." Agastya, for the nth time in his life, was glad that he was stoned. That lazy, pins and needles feeling behind the eyes and in the head distanced everything, made everything equally surreal and consequently equally acceptable. The banana trees, the 5 o'clock sun above a hillock, and the short bearded man beside him seemed as real and important as the words he spoke and the images they evoked. Initially, to him, Baba Ramana had seemed presently mad and completely remote, a do-gooder out of a book of legends for children, a small-time Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, or a male Mother Teresa. Later in the evening, in unsettling flashes, Baba Ramana's achievement had seemed inhuman, almost monstrous, as Agastya stared at the fields and orchards and the 2 wells, phoenixes that the Baba had helped to rise in triumph out of barrenness. He felt a little sick at the immensity of a human ambition, but also at its nobility and virtue, at the limitlessness of the potential of human endeavor, but also the infinite patience and craft required to bring the endeavor to fruition. "What do you know about leprosy?" asked Karant. A few meters ahead were children on 2 seesaws and a swing. Agastya quite liked the Karant beside him. He spoke well and explained intelligently. He didn't brag, but he was aware of the implications of his father's achievements. Agastya laughed, surprising Karant. "No, nothing really. All I know is that it's not contagious, and that in the early stages it can be quite easily cured." "Then you are not the average Indian," said Karant, as he smiled paternally at the children. Then he talked rubbish with them for a while. Shankaran Karant had at first found it difficult even to get the lepers to come to him, just as later Agastya learned that the tribals of Jampana had initially wanted the Naxalites to leave them alone. The really important and difficult thing was their psychological rehabilitation, to convince them after their flesh had stopped rotting that they were not freaks or monsters. Karant waved at someone, also getting them to work. Beggary is psychologically very damaging. It encourages a sort of fatal laziness. In the early years, some of the lepers hadn't liked the idea that Shankaran Karant wanted them to be independent, absolutely self-sufficient. "You are assistant collector, Madna, you said?" asked Karant abruptly, stopping outside a hut. Inside, a translator was playing bhajans. "No, not yet. I'm training here." "That partially explains your willingness to listen," Karant smiled cynically. "Most district officials are deaf. Before some German organization started funding us, none of them ever came here. Now it seems they can't leave us alone. They want to force a loan down our throats. 40 years later, they want to officially recognize the home, which means interfere in it. It wasn't his willingness to listen, Agastya guessed, that was encouraging Karen to speak. It was also Karen's own desire to talk to someone, anyone, prompted by the presence of an ear made sympathetic by a stoned head. Karen was a doctor too, but he had been educated at Pune. His wife and child were in Hyderabad. His father, Agastya sensed, had grown more uncommunicative. At the home, he could only talk to the lepers he and his father had helped to cure, and their only topic could be the daily routine of their lives. The board above the door of the hut said, "The weak became strong on Tolstoy Farm, and labor proved to be a tonic for all." The health department officials became even more excited when they saw these boards, said Carant, with an attractive cynicism in his voice. They must help us if we had the sanctity of quotations from Mahatma Gandhi. On the newer boards, we've stopped writing MK Gandhi, and no visitor gapes at them. One executive engineer, I forget his name, offered to make us a statue of the Mahatma. He said that he had built quite a few and seemed quite hurt when we refused. He didn't understand my father when he said that to build a statue is to forget the man, or is the first step towards a kind of idolatry. The executive engineer kept saying that we wouldn't have to pay anything for it. They sat on the earthen steps of the hut and drank more tea. Shankaran Karant finally got the lepers to dig a well and grow their own food on the land around them. He married a woman his parents had selected, but on the condition that she didn't object to his life. Over the years, the lepers thought him a miracle and called him the Baba, the father. Later, mulling over his visit, Agastya envied Baba Ramana most of all for knowing, when he had been merely Shankaran Karant, how to master his future. Karant asked suddenly, "Do you want to meet my father?" and looked almost relieved when Agastya hesitated and said, "No." Not surprisingly, however, he accepted an invitation to dinner. A shortened thumb, thumbs in place of some fingers, three-toed feet, some slightly awry faces, dinner with the lepers. He could barely admit to himself that he found the novelty of the experience faintly erotic, like a burgeoning fist deep in his belly. The driver wouldn't eat. "He has a few old-fashioned ideas about lepers," smiled Karant. The food wasn't celestial, rice, dal, spinach, curds, but Agastya decided that Vasant should turn a leper so that he could spend some time at the home to learn how to cook. "You wouldn't believe," said Karant, as they sat on the floor of the dining hall with the other residents of the home, "that these people were once like the beggars you see all over India. At Howrah station, for example, where the color and texture of their bodies were like their rags, gray and decaying, where they survived on trying to turn the apathy of the million passers-by into distaste or disgust, their visions of the universe appallingly simple, just a million tramping feet. The metamorphosis was miraculous," thought Agastya, as he watched a 3.5-fingered hand ladle him out some more curd. Generations of lepers, some stayed on to help the new entrants in the home, others left to try for a better life. "Do visit us again," said Karant as they walked to the jeep. "Yes, I shall try," said Agastya, truthfully for once, "but I am to spend the next 2 months in Jampana." "You shouldn't have eaten, sir," said the driver, worriedly as they moved off in the dark. "They are lepers." "You are right," said Agastya. "I can feel my fingers going numb. Look." And he held up his hand in the half-light from the dashboard. Criminally frivolous, so Neera later condemned his attitude towards the driver's idea of lepers. But then, when they met in Calcutta a few months later, she damned many other areas of his mind too. A mild winter, he was in bed and watching her large but comfortable body at the mirror. He irritated her terribly when he confessed that he envied Baba Ramana and the Naxalites of Jampana, not their nobility of purpose, but their certitude in knowing what to do with themselves. She turned, ethnic blouse in hand, and tried to explain in her strident Marxist way that the tribals and lepers were where they were because of the exploitation of the class to which she and he belonged, class nexus, etc. He laughed, enraging her even more, and said, I don't give a shit. Well, maybe a shit, but nothing more. I don't think Baba Ramana and those Naxalites, the better ones anyway, are doing all that out of a sense of guilt. They're doing it because they want to. To each his own. See, Nera? You can't really help anyone else if you yourself aren't feeling alright. Like Baba Ramana's son, Karanth. I don't think he's feeling so splendid. He meets his wife and child once in 6 months, and he had once wanted to be a neurosurgeon, but he also loves the home. So he's a little confused, see? And eager to talk to any stranger who looks a good listener. And the driver of that circus jeep, when you're feeling as fucked and confused as I always do, your mind revolves only around yourself. You can't be bothered about the opinions of others or about educating them. The only way out is to crack some secret joke and feel your belly shake silently. But she didn't understand. You don't understand, sir, shouted the driver over the noise of the jeep. Leprosy is not a joking matter. Suddenly, over the black shapes of trees on his left, Augustia saw a very large golden ball in the sky like something above an amusement park, some advertisement for frolic. For a moment he thought that they had covered the 1 hour's drive in 15 minutes, and that the ball was some space-age oddity of the Madna thermal power station. It was almost apocalyptic, the beauty of this moon, a huge globe of amber. He watched it all the way to Madna, a black sliver of cloud across its face, giving it a hint of Saturn. Our own Shani, yours and mine, Shankar had said, distant trees silhouetted against its faint orange glow, as against a fire, cotton, cloud banks tentatively touching its edges, red and luminous. It could have been, he thought, a planet aflame. So, asked Bajaj, how is Baba Ramana? Did he change his mind about the loan? He and Agastya were in his office, surrounded by the complementing shades of brown. No, sir, said Agastya. He's sulking, said Bajaj and laughed. He argues that government wants to give him a loan only because he's now a celebrity. But we can only give loans to people who we know will make good use of them. Yes, sir. So, off to Jampana? Bajaj leaned back in his chair and smiled sadly. We shall meet quite often, and anyway, there will be a development officers' review meeting every month. But your posting seems to have upset a few people in Jampana. The Sababati, you've met him once, you said, came here, tried to get me to cancel your posting order. Agastya showed his surprise. Then other politicians too, but I put them off by saying, look, it's only for 2 months, and Mr. Sen is an IAS officer. He will not let the IAS down. Just you wait, said Agastya silently. Bajaj slowly scratched an armpit. Half the population of the block of Jampana is tribal. Try and help them as much as you can. The main fear of the politicians there is that you will. The afternoon sun from the windows behind Bajaj's head lit him up. His ears glowed red, and Agastya could see the down on their edges gleaming golden. There's no caste war or anything like that in the area. Bajaj spoke as though Agastya was following him. It's simpler, just economics and politics. The tribals there have been ignored for decades, primarily because most of them stayed in those inaccessible hill forests. The money that was pushed into Jampana was directed by the politicians to benefit the non-tribal population of the plains. You know, primary schools, dispensaries, roads, wells, bank loans. In return, the same politicians were voted back to power in the local political body, the bloc panchayat. Your Sababati, for instance, has been president of that block panchayat for almost 30 years. The phone rang. Bajaj argued for a few minutes in a mix of the regional language and Hindi. Then he returned to the pep talk. Han Sen, so what was I saying? Yes, government cannot really be blamed for the his hands seesawed in the air. Skewed development of Jampana. You see, until a few decades ago, the tribals were practically invisible. Sometimes I feel sorry for them. They've never been touched by the Indian mainstream. What do the tribals of India have to show for these decades since 1947? Just a few photographs with Nehru. Bajaj shrugged sadly and Agastya shifted in his chair. The tribals began to leave the forests only after the forests were too ruined to sustain them. Of course, there have been critics, Bajaj nodded at Agastya, who quickly nodded back, who say that what the government has really done with its policies since 1947 is to ruin distinctive tribal cultures without providing any real compensations. And that is, as usual, because the critics have no idea of what they're talking about. A peon entered with 4 o'clock tea. Agastya whispered loudly to him that he wanted another cup. As BDO, said Bajaj in a more conversational tone, tour the block as much as you can. See villages, meet villagers. It'll give you a much better idea of the job. Of course, even now there aren't many all-weather roads deep in the forest. Bajaj, over his cup, eyed Agastya sadly, perhaps disappointed with him for not asking any penetrating questions, but also because it was his natural expression. You will ask why there are so few all-weather roads. So will the critics out of ignorance. What is the population of a tribal village? Some have as low a population as 50. Remember that till a few decades ago, many were nomadic, moving from one part of the forest to another. So their villages are scattered. So what do they expect? That we build a road to benefit a group of just 50 tribals? Absurd! He finished his cup and leaned forward to put it on the table. A road, like any other development program, has to be economically viable. No? So we say, here, if you group these villages together, ask them all to shift to 1 or 2 spots, then we'll help to develop the area, build their houses. Then the critics start wailing, you're ruining tribal culture, leave them alone. But show me one tribal who wants to be left alone, who is opposed to development as we understand it. Dispensaries, schools, roads, access to the markets, bus services, bank loans. Of course the tribals want all that, but for that they just have to live together in larger groups. We are a poor country. We can't have one road and one dispensary for every 50 tribals. Agastya finished his second tea and, looking down at the beige carpet, tensed himself, preparing as it were to leap out of his chair, thank Bajaj crisply, say that he would not let him down, sir, and walk out of the room with a heavy grace, dignified despite the burden of the development of a microcosm. Meanwhile, Bajaj continued to look at him, sadly, as though seriously doubting his usefulness to the government of India. Agastya looked up, the first movement of the exit that he had planned, and Bajaj said, Chipanti! You must visit Chipanti. It's a central tribal village in a group of villages spread over a vast area. And scarcity. Jampana is a terribly drought-prone block. Everyone will be complaining to you about the scarcity of drinking water from the first day. Agastya was at the door when Bajaj said, Oh Sen, I forgot to tell you something interesting. In some village near Chipanti, I think there were rumors about 2 years ago of a human sacrifice. Packing for Jampana. The Sant came to watch and criticize Digambar. Agastya remembered his first day. The train had been 4 hours late and he had felt as though he was living someone else's life. Then, on the first morning, he had been charmed by Tamsi's painting and had wondered whether these walls would grow on him too. Now 2 months in Jampana, then end of training, and he'd take a break in Calcutta before he returned to be assistant collector somewhere. It could be Rameri because he'd heard that Manon was about to be transferred. Bleak, isn't it? He said silently, smiling at his cassette recorder. To hanker after this room. I shall be coming to Madna at least once a month for meetings, etc. Try and keep this room free for me, he told Vasant. He should have told Sati that he was keeping his Gita a little longer. He should have left a letter for Mohan with Bhatia. Even though he had smelled hashish at the Jampana weekly bazaar, he should have picked some more cannabis. He should have stolen something from Bajaj's office that day. The BDO whom he had met on the veranda of the Jampana rest house and whose name he hadn't caught arrived at about 6 in the evening. You didn't tell me your name last time, said Agastya pleasantly. Patel, sir, he said, smiling. Patel apparently had come to warn him about his office. The Sababati always wants to use the office jeep for his private trips, sir. But you are IAS, sir. You can stop that. And the office superintendent is a most dangerous man. Agastya thought of a light-eyed man with a shoulder holster. He went to Shrivasthav's that evening. Shrivasthav concluded his lecture with, "You're beginning the best part of your training. Do it well." Next morning his suitcase, hold all and grip in the jeep, and he left for Jampana. Vasant's children raced the jeep to the rest house gate, a third trip down the road that he had traversed before with Kumar and then with Avery and Sita. But for the first time he was alone. The level crossing, lunch at Thielen, the driver drove slowly and carefully, and his middle-aged face was mildly cynical. Look, there's no need for urgency in driving or in any other government work. He had that kind of face. They reached Jampana at dusk, but the half-light could only marginally lessen the ugliness of the rest house. The caretaker gave him the room he had earlier given Avery and Sita. Tea on the veranda, the lamps were switched on at the sugarcane stalls, and the driver said, "I'll go now, sir, and come tomorrow at 10. The driver was at the jeep when Agastya said, "Oh, Chandram." The driver turned. When Mr. Patel was BDO, the jeep must have stayed at his house at night, no? "Yes, sir," said the driver. "Then where are you taking the jeep now? Shouldn't it remain with me at the rest house?" The driver's voice then changed faintly, an inflection of lessened innocence. "The Sababati asked for it, sir." Agastya thought it over. "Okay, 10 tomorrow." The jeep left. He went to rearrange his room. Then déjà vu, as he argued with the caretaker about extra furniture. "Look, I don't need this sofa and these 2 armchairs and that dining table." "But it's not a dining table, sir. It's a writing table." "Just take it away and remember, boiled water. Let the water boil for 5 minutes. That is, count 5 minutes after the water has begun to boil." After dinner on the veranda, night sounds and night music from the stalls, the caretaker surprised him with excellent coffee, a few lights on at the Dutch hospital. He wondered what Avery and Sita were doing at that moment, 2 months here in Jampana, and a job about which he knew nothing.